Welcome to Solve Climate by 2030. Today, universities in almost all 50 U.S. states, Puerto Rico, D.C., and several other countries are hosting state and region-wide webinars focused on ambitious and feasible things that we can all do in our cities, our towns, and states in the coming year to really move the needle on climate change. Here is the most important idea to take home today. What you do locally will change the future. Fact. The U.S. state of Georgia is a top 10 solar state. The neighboring Sunshine State of Florida has very little solar power due to outdated laws and regulations. When we launched Solve Climate a year ago, we could never have imagined that today entire countries and much of the world's economy would be shut down, with hundreds of thousands of people ill, thousands having passed away, and our health systems overwhelmed. I take that back. We could easily have imagined this. Our health experts and scientists warned us this was coming. After SARS and MERS, they told us this was coming, and yet we didn't take preventive action. We didn't prepare. COVID-19 has shown how fragile our health and economic systems are to extreme events. Our scientists have told us clearly that unchecked, climate change will turn our lives into an unending series of extreme events. Floods, droughts, rising sea levels, pests and disease, more extreme storms and hurricanes, all of this leaving hundreds of millions of people homeless and on the move. We can change this. We still have time to change that future. Last year, the world's top climate scientists told us that we have until 2030, 10 years now, to cut global warming pollution aggressively in order to stabilize the climate at the low end. That warning was the genesis for this national and international discussion today on how to solve climate by 2030. Solving climate in 10 years, that sounds challenging. And yet fixing the energy half of climate change by 2030 is looking more, not less likely than it was 4 years ago. The cost of solar and wind power, batteries, and electric vehicles have plummeted. In many cases, they are less expensive now than the fossil fuel power that causes global warming, and they are getting cheaper every day. Already, utility-scale wind and solar, big solar and wind farms that feed power into the grid, these technologies are crushing fossil fuels in much of the U.S. In Colorado, Idaho, and California, renewable bids are coming in at half the price that the cheapest fossil fuel plants can do. And this is where rooftop solar and battery systems are headed in the near future. On the vehicles front, all the major manufacturers see this coming. Mercedes-Benz announced last fall that they have designed their last gasoline-powered car. Going forward, every new model of theirs will be electric. Combining electric-powered vehicles with the impact of driverless technology, we could see a very rapid transition away from gasoline-based cars to EVs in the next decade. All this progress was the result of a major technology push by national governments. Starting in America in the 70s and then ramping up with the Danes, the British, the Japanese and Koreans, the Germans, and most recently the Chinese and Indians, government policies have brought these industries to scale. And now the market is taking over, and renewables, battery storage, and electric vehicles are on track to deliver power and transportation at prices unsubsidized that will lead to major disruptions of energy markets in the 2020s. Can we get there fast enough to solve climate? Well, this is where you come in. With plummeting prices for renewables and electric-powered transports, the pace of the clean energy revolution will no longer be determined by Washington, D.C. and other national governments. Instead, the core action is going to be in your city, at your electric utility, and in your state capital. The key to solving climate by 2030 will be clearing the path at the local level to rapid deployment of solar, wind, battery storage, and electric vehicles. We need to get rid of outmoded laws and regulations that are holding back the transition. Florida needs to take the lesson from Georgia. It's imperative that we have justice in this transition. We have to make sure that the millions of green jobs that are created are jobs for all, and that everyone has access to clean, affordable power and mobility. Today, in Nebraska and New Jersey, in Idaho and Alabama, in Bangladesh and Brazil, we're going to find out what are 3 ambitious but feasible things that we can do right at home to smooth the path for clean energy and to bring energy justice to our communities. Following the webinar, I hope you will join a group or class discussion about what you can do to make these solutions real. Then, what next? Well, this summer, young people in particular have a terrific opportunity to both support climate solutions and gain valuable job skills in a down economy. The most powerful thing you can do to solve climate by 2030 is to join the political campaign of a candidate who best represents your views on climate solutions. In doing that, you'll also learn how to communicate, you'll gain courage, and most importantly, be part of a creative, strong, powerful vision for the future. COVID-19 is giving us a stark lesson about what happens when we ignore warnings from science. Today, we'll see how 10 years can be enough time to drive the climate solutions that we need, and that the future will be what we make it. Thank you for the work you will do to solve climate.
You see the overall website, the Solve Climate by 2030, where many of you went to register for the event. The website for my own laboratory, the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory, RAIL, is below that. And then the Twitter handles for our panelists are at the bottom of the screen. And afterwards, we will post not only the slides on the Solve Climate page, but also on the RAIL website you see here. And sometime after, we will also publish on YouTube and on these two websites the video log of this conversation. Our panelists for tonight, I'll mention in a second, but I will begin with framing, and then we'll move to what's truly an exceptional panel where Adam Badwound from Grid Alternatives, Katharine Hayhoe from Texas Tech University, and Alex McDonough from Sunrun will represent to some extent civil society in terms of Grid Alternatives. Katharine Hayhoe is doing double duty for this event. In fact, I would say she's the Phil Collins of this event. If you remember back in 1985 at Live Aid, Phil Collins performed in London and flew to Philadelphia, and Katharine has performed in Texas and has flown out to us, and so she will have to leave us a bit before the end, but we'll make sure we get a Q&A as we go. The last part, and in some sense the most important part after the panel, is the community dialogue. And I see we already have 26 questions, comments in the chat box. And if you keep those coming, by the time we get to that in our second hour, we'll have a really lively conversation. The real starting point for this, though, is we can't escape the immediate crisis of COVID. And as we've seen, we do know that every disaster movie does start with the government somewhere ignoring a scientist. And maybe argue that in the US, we've ignored the scientists a little more in some other countries, such as South Korea and Singapore, but all of that really leads to a comparison for how much planning, how much thought goes into getting ready for a crisis, which really highlights the second cartoon, a one that I love, as we look at the little bump, as disastrous as it is for COVID. We all recognize here, that's why you're all on the call, to discuss the climate change part of the story. And really the lessons come in several forms. One is certainly that there is no substitute for doing research ahead of time. One of the prime reasons that we've seen such a reasonably smart and prompt response in some Asian countries is they took the lessons of SARS and MERS far more seriously than we did here. And they invested in the planning, the research to get themselves in a better, not ideal, but a better spot. As everyone who went to the grocery store, and whether you were queued up for toilet paper, or in Berkeley queued up for tofu, or ribs, or whatever it might be was your critical ingredient, we've seen how vulnerable the supply chains are around a crowded, denuded planet. And if you think that the COVID-19 crisis produced those sorts of supply chain disasters, things will get far worse with even the mildest expected effects of climate change. And in fact, it's not just that SARS and then MERS and now COVID came upon us relatively quickly. It's that what we've seen in terms of the transition from seeing only a few cases in the United States to now being, unfortunately, the global leader, is that these tipping points can happen exceedingly fast. And once again, if we think that they're fast with COVID, while climate change looks like a creeping threat, it actually can transition ecosystems, generate fires, droughts at a remarkable pace. The last point is perhaps the one bright spot in this otherwise terrifying moment we're in, and that is at least the lesson that we're all in this together has emerged. No country, no individual is protected from this more than any other. Some may have more means to take care of themselves, but this is a planetary emergency, just as climate change is. At the same time, the actions that we take individually critically matter. What we do in terms of protecting ourselves, our loved ones, our friends and neighbors in terms of taking defensive action against COVID-19 are similar to the things we can do on the positive side to build resilience in terms of investing in clean energy and other adaptation measures, but also how we can educate ourselves. And the last point is the one that's been really shot home in many countries, and that is, as a global community and as a local community, we're only as resilient as the most vulnerable members, something we know in the academic field as environmental justice. And as we look at the incredibly skewed rates of COVID in African American and low income, in migrant communities, in those in homeless encampments, we see that we can't hide behind our walls or our money. It is a group effort to address this, and as clearly as we need to take it on together, we see even in the COVID crisis that it doesn't take much of a disruption to change that picture. That's something we need to learn from climate. So as Eben Goodstein highlighted, the goal here is solving climate by 2030. So the first question on this is, can we solve it by 2030? Is this even a realistic goal given the international community is aiming at 2050? Well, there's many ways to slice and dice this question. One of them is, can we do it from a physical infrastructure basis? With wind and solar now the least cost forms of energy in many places, we can think about deploying those using realistic models of the power grid, of the transportation system in terms of powering electric vehicles, or in some places using biofuels if they're sustainable, or hydrogen. And so in my own case, a modeling effort in my own laboratory called Switch is an effort where all of the countries you see in green, or the regions for the United States, for China, for parts of East Africa, Central and Latin America, South Asia, we build models all the time that take realistic views of the infrastructure decisions, the planning efforts to build high voltage transmission lines, to invest in energy efficiency. So in the modeling efforts we do here, in every one of these regions marked in green, we have seen the transition is a reasonable opportunity by 2030. But models only begin the conversation. If we go to the next thinking on this, group Data for Progress has done polling across the country in liberal, conservative, a variety of communities. And you see the polling results that have come in just only 2 weeks ago highlight the incredibly strong support for renewable energy and for smart grid issues, for investing in batteries, electric buses, all the way down to the areas with really a mixed response, where there's more people opposed than for in terms of issues like transitioning to some of the artificial meats. But in terms of bipartisan polling, the lead issues, the investing in renewable energy, is certainly a doable part of the equation. But let's keep going in terms of, can we solve it by 2030? If we look at the price that on economic terms we call the overnight cost, meaning if we were to launch a new project tomorrow morning, what would be the cost of different technologies around the country? And so using an absolutely wonderful website developed by the University of Texas at Austin and their Energy Institute, here you see the least cost technology across the entire country. You can see the rust color where natural gas is cheapest today with no price on carbon. A large swath of the middle of the country and upstate New York, including where I'm from in Ithaca, New York, all have wind as the least cost. And then areas in the southeast and in the southwest have today solar being the least cost. We know, however, that whether we want to face it or not, the price of carbon shouldn't be $0 a ton as we use today as our national number. In fact, if we jump to the price of carbon in California at $20 a ton, we see the map changing significantly, where the areas where solar is the least cost expand, wind retains that lowest area, the areas where gas is least cost shrink a bit, and then in the upper areas of Wisconsin and the Michigan Peninsula, we see areas where nuclear would be the least cost. This $20 a ton number is the market price today of carbon in California and our trading partner, Quebec. But if we jump to what economists think is the true social cost of carbon, reflecting the damages to ecosystems and communities, we see a map transform dramatically. At that social cost of carbon, something that the United States Environmental Protection Agency still uses in its analysis, that may surprise some of you, it surprises me, we see a national map dominated by solar and wind, with small pockets remaining where nuclear and gas are the cheapest. So in terms of a cost basis, we certainly know that we are at the tipping point or even over in terms of being able to do this from a financial basis. And the downside of not doing it is dramatic. Before the Paris Climate Conference, we were looking at a world heading towards 4 or 5 degrees C of warming. And even at 3 degrees C, we see essentially everyone on the planet, almost 8 billion people, would be dramatically impacted by heat waves, half the people on the planet by water stress, the risks in terms of power production, almost 1 billion people, almost 2 billion people, crop damage, habitat degradation. But if we jump to the world that we're aiming for in terms of the international community, at 1.5 degrees, we see a transformed picture where none of these threats go away, but we dramatically reduce our risks. We essentially inoculate ourselves to a very significant degree against some of the worst damages. Heat waves are still an issue, water stress is still a critical issue, and again, largely for the world's poor, but we start to bring down these risks dramatically. So from the modeling perspective, from the polling perspective, from the economic perspective, this 2030 goal is a realistic target and a needed target to really make the change we need. In fact, if we look at what SARS has already unleashed on the planet, where the United States had over 6 million unemployment claims in the last period, we're looking suddenly at unemployment levels from the virus alone that rival or exceed the Great Depression. And of course, this curve with unemployment bumping up and down through various recessions has to remind all of us of the famous hockey stick curve, a very similar issue where after bounce back and forth, we are in the phase now of this frightening takeoff. And so again, the COVID analogies for climate are a serious part of the picture. If we tie this together, we're in a world where our emissions are rising, and the sooner we act, we make this job far easier. In fact, this famous paper, which is the source of the so-called 10 years to save the climate, a paper I'm very pleased to have been a contributor and author on, really highlights that the more we wait, of course, our global emissions rise. But as a physicist, what really gives me most concern is the longer we wait, the steeper the slope of that line has to be. And the blue line has an average slope of about 3% improvement per year. And I'll come back to that number in a second. The rust-colored line is 4% per year, sustained for decades. And the red one is a 5% per year decarbonization or drop. The worry is that at best, we've seen regions or countries, China did it, Denmark did it, California did it, where we sustained the blue curve, that 3% per year for a few years at a time. No one has sustained it for decades. And the longer we wait, it's not the peak that worries me personally, it's the sustained need for dramatic, unprecedented cuts. And if anything gives us pause to say, we need to pull every reasonable lever, from personal activities to corporate activities to national efforts to partnerships, this curve puts it in a stark perspective. Within California, our path has been interesting and has been one of leadership. We set our so-called renewable portfolio standard to be 20% powered by renewables by 2010. We missed that target. We threw a bit of a party to highlight we needed to do better. We made it 3 years late in 2020 when we also looked forward for our 2020 target of 33%, a target that we met several years early, even though we met our 2010 target slightly late. And our 2030 target is now 60% clean energy, and that's really one where we've taken a few important steps forward. 2 years ago, California passed Senate Bill 100, calling for 100% clean energy in 2045 and setting that 60% standard for 2030. And in California, one key aspect is that we don't count nuclear and we don't count large hydro in terms of our mix. And that makes our situation quite different than many other parts of the world where large hydro, such as in New York State where I come from, or China where both large hydro and nuclear count towards their targets. Again, each place targets their own, but it really helps us to set the perspective. California's mix is important, and it's due to many of you on the call. Not only did we pass our initial bill, Assembly Bill 32, that called for us to get back to our 1990 emission levels by 2020, but as we move forward, we moved into the Senate Bill 100 that I mentioned that called for 100% green energy, including transportation, by 2045. But our new climate bill, Senate Bill 32, due to then Senator Fran Pavley, who was also the author of Assembly Bill 32, is one that not only calls for us to stay on the path I highlighted, but perhaps more importantly, included environmental justice. In our carbon market, California now calls for 35% or more of our cap and trade revenues to be spent on supported, environmentally at-risk communities. California had a solar mandate of 1 million rooftops by 2020, a goal we met early, and a goal of 1 million electric vehicles, a goal we are not quite all the way to, but I'm hoping we get there by the end of the year, and other bills are pending as well. In fact, California has really put this in an interesting context. Took us 7 years to get it done, but the Public Utilities Commission in California passed a requirement that every new home built in California after January 1st of this year generate as much energy as it needs through a mixture of aggressive energy efficiency and any renewable, but rooftop solar being the most likely. And this is a piece which highlights both the technical upside and something I'll get to in a second, the challenge of making this a just transition, not just a green transition. At the same time that California passed that target for 2020, something we know how to do, we have over 1 million solar roofs today, California did something else, which is the one I'm perhaps most proud of. We passed a requirement for 2030 to make our office buildings of any height also net zero energy. The household goal we know how to do. This one for 2030, we do not yet know how to do in an affordable way. Presumably a mixture of super aggressive energy efficiency, solar, perhaps clear solar for windows, fuel cells in basements, heat pumps, a whole variety of technologies. But this is the bold side of that 2030 goal, setting a goal we don't know how to do at this moment. In fact, that leads me to the final area, and that is we need to learn from our mistakes, admit them, and find ways to do things better. And just as that target of solar rooftops for every new home is so exciting, it also highlights one of the challenges in the way we've approached climate energy issues in the past. We've largely found ways to subsidize innovations we need, but subsidize those for the already affluent. After all, you have to own a home or have title or the rights to a home to be able to install solar on it. That means that if we're using public dollars to do so, everyone is subsidizing the few. And one of the most problematic areas of any global movement is where we have capitalism for the poor and socialism for the rich. We need to find a way to make this a just transition. One of the most striking areas is, in fact, housing, where we need to find ways to put solar or make solar available to those who are renters through partnerships with landlords, through hosting solar on neighboring buildings, to not only bring down the power bill of lower income people, but also to make their energy costs more predictable. And as we get into our panel discussion, I know that both Adam Badwound and also Alex McDonough will have comments to say about this. The other one, of course, is transportation. In many parts of the country, we have a drive till you qualify situation where in some of the best job areas, the housing costs have gone through the roof. And so the poorer you are, the longer you commute, the less time you spend with your children, with your family. This is something we need to address. California has not been successful yet. We've had 2 efforts to try to pass a significant bill that would invest in rent-controlled infill housing. This has not gotten through our legislature at this point, and it highlights how much we need to learn about the justice side of the equation. In fact, opportunities come from a whole variety of groups. One of the true progressive organizations in the state, the Climate Center, has highlighted how through community choice and aggregation, we can find ways to bring clean energy to not only the affluent, but the less affluent. And today, the 20 community choice aggregators across the state, serving 11 million people, perhaps a quarter of the state, are being met with clean energy for large number of areas. And these essentially are opportunities to turn brown or light brown fields into green fields by having community investment strategies take off in the process. Another area is tied in some sense to the dialogue around COVID, where we've just seen the passage of a stimulus package that will put roughly $1,200 into many Americans' pockets as, however, a one-shot deal. A dialogue that has ramped up dramatically in Europe and is now doing the rounds in Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., is to think about a next package that would be a green stimulus, that would not only put checks in people's pockets, but would invest in many of the areas that we need, not only to put Americans back to work, but also to do so in a way that invests in this clean transition. This is just one example website. It is a package that was released last week that has been doing the rounds again in the US House and Senate. And it's essentially a laundry list or a menu of many of the things we'll get into in the conversation. Investing in jobs programs in low-income areas, restarting credits for installing solar or wind or heat pumps, investing in programs that bring green jobs to inner city and marginalized areas around the country. And it's, again, one of the examples that we'll get into in the conversation. As we wrap up, we want to think broadly about opportunities in the labor and the workforce. What can we do in transportation, in energy, in agriculture, forestry, land use? How can we learn from the COVID crisis to invest more equitably? And how can we make our overseas engagements greener and partnerships that lead to cleaner energy solutions that bring justice to much more of the population than the affluent? Again, we're going to get ready to move over to the dialogue, but I really want to highlight that if you think that this sounds like an unworkable menu, just remember that barely 2 years ago, Greta Thunberg was conducting her strikes for climate as a lone teenager. And this past September, we had millions of people worldwide in coordinated climate strikes, arguably the largest such mass movement we've seen. And one of the good things about the climate process led by youth is that unlike the Woodstock Festival, where the number of people who claim they were there is vastly higher than the number who were there, the climate strikes are a weekly event. You can't miss it. It's going forward from this day. And that's exactly the mindset we want to see in this dialogue here in Solve Climate by 2030. even if you're missing this webinar or can't stay for the chat, we are going to find ways such as what you'll see on all of the websites, from the one here at Berkeley to the national one, ways to get involved, opportunities, groups. You heard Eben mentioning some of the opportunities to engage with politicians to share some of your views. And as we make the transition, let me introduce the next step of our process. Again, we're incredibly lucky to have Adam Badwound from Grid Alternatives, a nationally award-winning group that not only provides opportunities to do energy efficiency and solar for low-income communities, but also does training for people who have dropped out of school, are coming out of prison. And this is an effort that has grown, and we'll hear from Adam in launching that in a second. We're incredibly fortunate to have Katharine Hayhoe with us. She is a professor of political science at Texas Tech and director of their Climate Center, and one of Time Magazine's 50 most influential people. She is both versed on the climate science and on the political science, political side, and has perhaps done more than any other individual to really enable a dialogue between communities of faith, communities that are agnostic, and others, and thinking about how we fit this into our broader conversation. Alex McDonough will be our third finalist. He is the Director of Public Policy for Sunrun, largest installer of rooftop solar, and a former advisor to Senator Harry Reid from Nevada. And so I'm going to bring each of them on. They'll each show a couple slides to launch the conversation, and then we will engage for a little over half an hour in dialogue and then truly throw it open. So let me start with Adam, and I just want to welcome you all and thank you all so much for joining us. We'll do each of the three, but after Katharine's, we'll take a couple questions if they're directed to her, because she does have to depart a little bit early because, again, like Phil Collins, she's doing double duties tonight. But we'll start with Adam.
Thank you, Professor Kammen. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Sound check? Great.
Very good.
Wonderful. Yeah, well, I'm really honored to be a part of this panel this evening and sit alongside Phil Collins during a crisis moment. So my name is Adam Badwound. I'm Vice President of Philanthropy at Grid Alternatives. I'll tell you a little bit about our organization and the work we do. I'll try and keep it brief and leave time for questions or to share more during the conversation. But I'm Vice President of Philanthropy, and so I'm here to talk to you a little bit about how civil society plays a key role in the transition to a renewable energy economy, but also to advance our efforts to fight climate change. I really want to just appreciate the first or second slide that Professor Kammen shared about how we're all in this together, because I really do think that our organization represents the truth of that statement and the importance that we will get through the transition to renewable energy and fight climate change better if we work together. So my personal mission is to strengthen people and planet through philanthropy. And for me, it's equally important that we think about the environmental and the economic and the social impacts of our approach to fighting climate change. Now, when I say that my mission is to strengthen people and planet through philanthropy, I don't actually mean that our solutions lie in the accumulated wealth of billionaires and they're donating that. That's not exactly what I mean. What I mean is the real true word of the root words of the word philanthropy, which are philos and anthropos in Greek, which means love of humanity. And so I think that it's really important that we think about civil society as really coming together as representing collective action, social movements, and community resilience. So I work for Grid Alternatives. It's the nation's largest nonprofit solar installer and solar job training organization. And I think of the work we, as I said, do really embodies this kind of collective cross-sector collaboration that's required. So for example, we need favorable solar policies that help us to advance the technologies that private companies are producing, and we need volunteers and people from civil society to fund this work and to bring it all together for us. So you can learn more about our work at gridalternatives.org, but our vision is a transition to renewable energy that includes absolutely everybody. And so we really want to think about those who are the hardest to reach, those who are the least served by our economic system, and to create opportunity for them to engage in the transition to renewable energy, to benefit from reduced pollution, to have economic savings and other areas of impact. our mission is to make this renewable energy technology and job creating accessible to frontline communities. So we measure this and we think about this work in several ways, but the first is the front lines of social justice and racism, and you know, helping to have people that are the least advantaged in our society. On the planet front, we think about the front lines of environmental justice and climate change and pollution and environmental factors. And then for economic opportunity, we really want to think about how we can serve those on the front lines of job creation and economic benefit in the transition that we're working toward. So our organization was founded in 2001. We've got offices across the country, heavily covering all of California. We have 3 international sites. We do work in Mexico, Nicaragua, and Nepal. Our work in those areas is very much about energy access, but also about disaster recovery, which we know is climate change based and things like hurricanes, but also there's other factors like earthquakes and other natural disasters where renewable energy is particularly helpful. We have about a $70 million annual budget and about 360 employees, just to give you a little bit of background. You can change it to the next slide, please. So I know there's a lot of information on this. I just kind of actually wanted to share this as a quick overview of the areas of impact that we can measure in this work that we do. So if you go to gridalternatives.org, we have a little subpage called our impact calculator. I pulled these figures just this morning, but we really like to think about how our work really can have a triple bottom line benefit. And so on the social front, on people, and these figures again were pulled this morning off of our website. If you click refresh in real time, you'll see the latest figures that our organization has produced. But on the people front, we can measure our impacts by the number of households we've served. And so that's the direct benefit to families. The number of community facilities that we've installed solar on. So we do that as well to help amplify the effect of the technology and the benefit. And then of course, the lifetime savings that these produce economically to help these communities who need the savings as well. On the planet front, we can measure in a variety of ways, of course, the impact of reducing carbon, but we can also measure the impact of the clean energy we're producing, so in kilowatt hours, the tons of greenhouse gas emissions that we're preventing, and other ways of communicating that impact, such as things like cars taken off the road, trees planted, and I'm sure you've seen many of those kinds of impact statements. And then finally, in the employment front, we can certainly measure the number of people that have received hands-on experience through our training programs, the number of hours that they're gaining experience on the rooftop or on the ground crew, and also the job training partners that we work with across the country. I want to acknowledge that I'm on a panel with a leader at Sunrun, and I just want to thank Sunrun for their support. Sunrun is a major partner of Grid Alternatives and has been for a long time, and we really greatly appreciate Sunrun's commitment to the communities that we serve and your corporate partnership. So basically on the right side, I just had kind of a list here of the variety of different program offerings that we have. So while we're doing our solar installations, we consider our model to be somewhat of a classroom on the roof where you can get your hands on and get job training or get experience or just learn more about the technology and interface with the communities. So we have no-cost solar installations based thanks to rebate and incentive programs in the state of California for households that qualify. We provide training to connect people with the job pathways of being a solar installer in particular, but other career pathways such as being an electrician or other areas. We are working more and more with multifamily affordable housing providers, which enables us to serve the renter community better. And we're also doing more community and shared solar installations, which also can have a variety of benefits, including those to renters. We have a policy team that's working closely with state and somewhat to, when we can, federal policymakers to really advocate and advance for low-income solar policy. We also do work with a variety of different stakeholders around program design and implementation. Our work, as I mentioned, is in 3 countries, but we also work with Native American tribes across the country. We worked to date with 44 Native American tribes, and we also are the key program administrator for many of the clean mobility programs from the state of California. And we have a growing program area around clean mobility, which we consider electric vehicles, but the entire infrastructure. Now, just I'll kind of close in with a comment to say that this has really been important to me, that the transition that we think about really is inclusive of everybody. I'm a member of the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe in southwestern South Dakota. And it just really warms my heart that we can really serve that reservation and those people, because they're certainly they're certainly in need of the renewable energy transition, but they're also, Native American tribes are so uniquely positioned with a variety of challenges, political, social, cultural, geographic, economic, the list goes on. And I think that Native American tribes are really resilient communities and can really embody and represent the face of resilience. And so I really think it's really special to be able to see how tribes are responsive to their energy sovereignty needs, but also able to be leading examples of how we can get through the climate crisis resiliently. So with that, I'll turn it over. I'm not sure if I should wait till questions till the end, but I think I'll just do just that, although I do see some in the chat.
And you could answer them by typing in the chat too, probably, if you wanted to.
Okay, I'll do that. Well, yes, that's a great idea.
Because Katharine's going to have to go, what we'll do is we'll save the questions and the conversation with you and also with Alex till the end, and we'll talk after Katharine does her intro, and then a few questions for her as well, as long as she can stay.
Perfect.
So thank you so much, Katharine. And again, we're so pleased to have you on.
Well, thank you for having me. This webinar is about solving climate, and really you have the perfect trifecta of people here to talk about this. You have people who understand the policy, who understand the technology, and who actually understand how to implement this with Dan, with Alex, and with Adam. I am a bit of the odd woman out here because I am the Cassandra. I am the one who is standing there as the climate scientist saying, woe to us if we do not change our ways. As climate scientists, we study how climate is changing. We know that humans are responsible. We look at the different outcome of our choices, but after that, we say, that's where we're done. We need everybody else to come in and help. How do we change at the level of our society? How do we change at the level of our culture? How do we change at the level of individual businesses or communities or households? That's really where this discussion is going, and it is exactly what we need to be talking about today. So, well, I'm always available to talk about climate science. What I want to do is I just want to tackle the elephant in the room for a couple of minutes, because reviewing the questions, I saw a lot of questions come in on this already, and I want to make sure that we have some of the facts laid out to go into the discussion. Because right now we are in the middle of a global pandemic. The world has not seen a pandemic like this since over 100 years, since the Spanish flu. And in fact, I have a personal connection to that because the Spanish flu took the lives of both of my great-grandparents. And that is why my last name is actually Hayhoe, because my grandfather, whose last name was Scott, was adopted by his aunt Scott, who married a man called Hayhoe. So he took both names. So that is actually the story of my name. It's due to a pandemic. This pandemic today, though, is sweeping the world. It is causing untold suffering, not only physically, although that is tremendous, but also economically. As people's jobs are being devastated, as industry shuts down, there is tremendous suffering. But you've probably seen the headlines that there is what I call here in the slide, some slightly positive news. I don't think I would even go so far as to call it a silver lining, because I don't think you can say that there is a silver lining to a pandemic. The slightly positive news we're seeing, though, is that we have seen, mostly due to decreases in industry, and a little bit due to decreases in transportation also, we have seen measurable decreases in air pollution and likely measurable, it'll take a little bit longer to figure this out, but likely measurable decreases in carbon emissions as well. You're probably familiar with these maps of pollution over China. There's similar maps for Italy, and I'm starting to see a few come out for North America as well. Next slide. Here's the bad news, though. The bad news is that climate, air pollution, fossil fuels, and respiratory diseases like SARS and coronavirus are intimately linked. A brand new Harvard study just came out today showing what we already knew was true for SARS, that people who live in areas that already have significant air pollution long-term are much more likely to suffer and even die if they contract the virus as people who don't. Further bad news on the right-hand side is this. Our carbon emission reductions are likely to be quite short-lived, because as the stimulus packages come out, as industry starts to recover, it'll likely ramp right back up to where it was and then some. And not only that, but as this article that I snapshot the cover of here, an MIT article, why the coronavirus outbreak is terrible news for climate change. As it points out, we've got falling oil prices, which makes fossil fuels cheaper than they've been in years, even decades in some places. And whenever we're faced with a crisis, we tend to focus on what's right in front of us rather than the longer term issue, which could mean diverting resources, attention, and even time away from climate action. Last slide. But lest you be discouraged, and that is very discouraging, I want to close with some potentially good news. Now, let's be clear, the carbon emission reductions and the air pollution emission reductions that have been achieved by this pandemic were not achieved in a sustainable manner. What do I mean by that? They were achieved by turning everything off, by everybody staying in their homes, by everybody physically distancing, by people shutting down their businesses and their places of work, which has tremendous financial consequences. They were achieved in ways that are not sustainable long term. But here's the thing. Imagine if the magnitude of reductions that we achieved in just the last 2 months were actually achieved through sustainable ways, like Dan, like Adam, and like Alex will be talking about. Imagine if they were achieved through increasing efficiency, through substituting clean energy for fossil fuels, and through drawing down carbon from the atmosphere into the soil and the biosphere where we actually want it. Imagine if that were the case. So I did some very rough back of the envelope calculations, and I have my Twitter thread here. If you want all the details and the references, just look for this Twitter thread, and it has all of them there. I'll post it in the chat window too so people can see it. But if we assume the pandemic led to carbon emission reductions of 10 to 15%, if we want to get on track to meet the 1.5 degree target from the Paris Agreement that Dan talked about, we have to have about at least a 40% reduction by 2030. Well, it turns out that we would already be anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of the way there in just 2 months. Is that not amazing? It is. Now, again, this is not the way to do it. Let's be 100% clear on that. This is not the way to do it, and the changes are not permanent, nor are they sustainable. But the fact that it was possible to achieve those with such draconian measures in just 2 months, what could we do with much healthier, sustainable, less draconian methods that have plenty of co-benefits and side effects that address systematic issues of injustice and poverty and socioeconomic inequality and even gender inequality? How much more could we accomplish if we truly understood that climate change poses an even greater threat to our health and our safety and the future of our civilization long term? Thank you.
Before we go over to Alex, is to pick and choose a couple questions. And even though Alex hasn't got to introduce Sunrun yet, if either Adam or Alex want to jump in, that's fine. But I'm going to try to target them a little bit to you, Katharine, so that we feel like we've got some of the ground covered as you go. And I just want to commend you for highlighting, I don't want to call it a silver lining as you highlight either, but what it does tell me is that these are not necessarily as hard as we make it sound without acting. Now, nobody wants 30% unemployment. Nobody wants to see African Americans at 70% more hospital admits, but it does highlight that we've got some levers that we're learning about. So let me start with one to you, because I don't know anybody who has done as much as you've done to engage and to sustain a dialogue between the environmental, the climate community, and communities of faith. And one of the big challenges about developing a movement is finding ways to integrate people in who rightly or wrongly feel they were excluded from that. And I'd love it if you wouldn't mind starting with a little bit on the dialogue side, Adam working with the tribes, and certainly Alex as well in terms of highlighting how to bring solar. But let me start with you on that one, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. So I have a really unique experience of being embedded within the evangelical church. And people might say, well, how can you be an evangelical and a climate scientist? The answer is, I'm Canadian. And what that means is, in Canada, climate change has not traditionally been a politically polarized issue. An evangelical refers to what you believe about your faith. It is not a political position or an affiliation with a given political party as it is here in the US. But because I'm part of that community, I've been able to have thousands of fascinating conversations with people who have concerns, they have worries. They do feel, as Dan said, that they've been sidelined or slighted, or they're being pushed to the back of the line. And through that, I've learned this. I've learned that it is possible to have a constructive conversation with almost anyone about climate change. Now, I'm going to put an asterisk there. Almost anyone. The Yale program on climate communication divides us out into 6 groups. 58% of us are either alarmed or concerned about climate change already. Then the next biggest group is cautious people. That's the next biggest group. Then we have people who are disengaged and doubtful. And at the very end, we have 10% of us who are dismissive. In other words, we will dismiss anything and everything. 1,000 scientists, 10,000 peer-reviewed publications, 200 years of climate science, even an angel from God with brand new tablets of stone saying global warming is real and foot high letters of flame, a dismissive would dismiss. We all have a dismissive in the family. I do, you probably do too. The person who brings this issue up, who can't resist sneering at the polar bears or the children's strikes. It is not possible to have a constructive conversation with a dismissive except under really truly unusual circumstances, but they're only 10% of the population. Everybody else it is. But how do we do that? We do it by beginning the conversation not with something we disagree on. If you're already disagreeing, that's not the time to have the conversation. Begin the conversation with something you agree on. Connect the dots to how climate change might be affecting something that you both already care about. And then, and this is the most important part, and this relates directly to this webinar, bring up a positive, constructive solution that they can get on board with. Because the number one reason why the majority of people in the United States who purport to reject the science of climate change has nothing to do with science, and it has nothing to do with religion. It has everything to do with solution aversion. They think the only way to fix climate change is destroy the economy. And you are now uniquely equipped, thanks to the panelists in this webinar, to bring up amazing, positive, constructive solutions. I was writing down some as I heard Adam talk. I'm always collecting new examples. You can share these with people, and that is what inspires us. So I actually have a whole TED Talk that goes into it in more detail. So if you want more details, I'll put the link in the chat. But that really is the most important thing that every single one of us can do, is have a conversation about it. Thank you.
Well, so please do put it into the chat, but let me ask if either Adam or Alex want to jump in on this as well, because you've each also worked with communities that were left out of the conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to, and sorry to jump right in, Alex, but to comment about faith-based communities in particular, of course, for the tribal communities we work with, the climate crisis is very much an existential threat with a very much spiritual element. Of course, we know that Native populations have a different relationship with Mother Earth, and so there is very much a faith-based component to that work as well. But I would say that actually faith-based communities, I'm glad you're Canadian and you can see another way of living, because the politicization of faith-based communities is actually very detrimental, and we need those communities. And so in our work at GRID, one of the things that I've really enjoyed seeing in this work is the surprising collaborators and people that join us. And like church groups will volunteer to go on trips on our international programs because as a community, they want to be responsive to need. We have donors who are that donate to our organization, and they do so because they feel that it's part of their spiritual practice of tithing or whatever their faith tradition is, but they really want to help people, and there's really much a humanitarian element to this, and they see the benefits of the technology in making people's lives better. And so I think that it's very important that we essentially engage with faith-based communities and those that might not seem like the most likely of collaborators. I also think it's just also always important that we think about who are we leaving out of this movement, who's being left behind. People returning from the criminal justice system that are seeking employment opportunities. People who can really come from all walks and stripes can join us on the roof and be a part of our movement. So I just think that it's important that we constantly ask that question: is who's not being a part of this conversation, and how can we get them to join us? Yeah.
So I've been very unfair to Alex. I'm going to bring him in now. And so Alex, if you don't mind, I would love you to introduce yourself, and we'll move to the next slide for you as well. And then I'm going to come back to Katharine, once we get all of our panelists kind of equally on stage.
Sounds great. I appreciate it. And just, just quickly chiming in on that last question, I think Adam hit the nail on the head here. Partnership with communities to make sure that everybody is part of the solutions and gets to experience and enjoy the benefits is critical. And that's why I'm so grateful for the partnership that we have with Grid Alternatives and putting solar in the hands of families in underserved and low-income communities so that they can enjoy the benefits and be part of this climate solution is just so incredibly important, and we need to do so much more to make that ubiquitous. So just to quickly introduce myself, Alex McDonough, Vice President for Public Policy for Sunrun. Sunrun is the nation's largest national residential solar and battery installer. We're headquartered in California, have a second headquarters in Denver, Colorado. And we're also working, and we work with partners like Grid Alternatives and multifamily housing developers to expand solar access to low-income families. And we're also pioneering turning residential energy systems into virtual power plants that serve the entire grid. So before Sunrun, I was captivated by the prospects of empowering people with the ability to solve climate change in their own lives. It comes back to what Professor Kammen said. We're all in this together, and we're all part of the solution. So if you look at my first slide here, actually, second slide. There we go. Communities are changing the way energy is produced and consumed. So according to the International Energy Agency, renewables will grow by 50% globally over the next 5 years. Now, solar PV will be 60% of that growth. And distributed solar on homes and in communities will be half of all solar growth. That shows how important small distributed community-based solar is going to be for this transition to clean energy and addressing climate change. And a large portion of these systems will be paired with battery storage. Forecasts show that nearly half of all storage will be these small systems. This is going to be a huge shift in how communities get power and think about energy and reliability. And we're actually seeing this in California in real time. The energy system is shifting towards more local, clean generation, less dependent on central station fossil fuels. And as we experience necessary blackouts, public safety power shutoffs in order to avoid wildfires, the utilities are having to make these decisions in order to mitigate risk. Families and small businesses and communities are realizing how important it is that they have that local resiliency and the ability to sustain and ride through these outage situations. So a battery with a solar system allows a home to, one, consume more of the solar that they generate and send less back to the grid. Two, it allows them to use the battery rather than pay expensive peak demand prices that usually occur later in the afternoon and evening. And three, it gives them backup power when there's a blackout. Sunrun systems, for example, allow a customer to enjoy backup power for 8 to 12 hours. If we can go to slide 2. Moreover, these systems are able to be aggregated. Solar and battery storage systems on homes are able to be aggregated and not only provide benefits in terms of savings and backup power to the customers that have them on their homes, but also to provide resources to the entire grid. Sunrun, for example, has launched these what we call virtual power plants in California, in Oakland, one of our first, actually our first projects, aggregating low-income multifamily housing, low-income apartment buildings with solar and batteries installed to provide clean energy to those buildings, to the tenants, but also to help Oakland back out a jet fuel fired dirty power plant and clean up the air in downtown Oakland. We have an aggregation in Hawaii we have a contract with the electric utility in Hawaii to aggregate 1,000 homes to provide similar resources to the island of Oahu. And we have put out a concept paper for Los Angeles, for the city of Los Angeles, to shut down its natural gas plants and replace them with distributed solar and battery resources in this type of aggregation. So I will stop there. Happy to answer additional questions, but so grateful to be part of this conversation and appreciate the hard work that Professor Kammen and the team has put together, has done to put this opportunity together.
Well, and in particular, we have just a fabulous list of questions coming up in the chat. So I'll try to do just one more round for the panelists, and then we'll really open up and dig into these. And so something that came up in Adam's comments, in Alex's comments, and very much in Katharine's in terms of building bridges. I want to ask each of you, and maybe we'll start with Adam, to say, give me an example of an opportunity where you really thought that the transition, whether it's economically or socially in a community, would really be hard, but also something that enabled you or an example to really make something happen. Maybe I'll go to Adam first, and then to Katharine, and then back to Alex, in terms of something where whether you want to call it the synergies or the opportunities to work together on a solve climate issue ended up, sort of giving you follow-on or co-benefits, as we often call it, making the job easier.
Making the job easier. Well, not entirely sure I understand the question, but I'll just go ahead and comment. There's a lot of different communities that we serve that have a variety of different needs, and we do think that community-based solutions are the place to start. So really looking for solutions that come from the way that the community defines their goals. But some of the work we do, for example, in Nepal. So that is obviously a quite different society than the domestic United States. And so the work we do in Nepal, and I've been having a side chat with my co-panelist here, but the work we do in Nepal is actually very much a story about empowering women and providing opportunities for women to be able to do more productive work in their home and to be able to be the core of their family and to really enable the economic and environmental benefits. Women are often cooking with dirty cook stoves in Nepal, and so cleaner technologies that can come along and enable electrically based solutions can actually benefit their health directly and the health of their families. But empowering women for a variety of reasons, and we should probably just chat this TED Talk that she just shared with. But there's a lot of benefits to really thinking creatively about how these solutions can have social, cultural, and a variety of other different benefits. So I'll chat that TED Talk in, but that's just one idea that comes to mind too.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Katharine, I know you've dealt with this all the time in terms of surprising wins out of this. Can you relate one as well?
Absolutely. Well, I would love to share a surprising win that doesn't come from me, but it comes from somebody who you may all have heard of. A man called John Cooke, who is the inspiration and the brain behind skeptical science. So if you're not familiar with skeptical science, I'll put the link in the chat here. It is a tremendous online resource that tackles every sciencey sounding myth about climate change you have ever heard. It provides fully cited and peer-reviewed answers to every single objection. And the reason why John created this website was because his father was a dismissive. So every time he'd go visit his dad would be like, well, John, there's more polar bears now than there ever have been. How can you say that they're decreasing? So John becomes the premier expert in debunking sciencey sounding myths about climate change. He goes back to school. He gets a PhD in social psychology to understand our cognitive biases. And do you think it changed his father's mind? No. Then in the area where his dad lives in rural Australia, there was a rebate program on solar panels. And here's the connection. His dad's identity is that of a fiscal conservative. So up until then, all of the climate solutions were very opposed to his identity. But the idea of, taking money and actually saving money, that totally fits. So he signed up, he got his panels, he saved so much money, he started sending updates every month to his son on how much money he was saving. And then, I don't know, I think it was about a year and a half, 2 years later, John told me they were at dinner one time and the topic of climate change came up and his dad said, "Oh yes, of course it's real. I've always thought so. But have I told you how my solar panels are doing lately?" So what changed his mind? It was having viable, practical solutions that changed his mind. And yes, those solutions are sometimes tangible solutions. We've talked a lot about solar. But my favorite solutions are actually solutions that relate to education and societal changes. You're probably familiar with Project Drawdown. If you're not, it's a fantastic clearinghouse that collects all the research people have done in many other areas and brings it together in one big list of climate solutions. And my favorite solution on the whole list, personally, although of course we need them all, we can't just pick one, but the one that really touches my heart is the education of women and girls in developing countries. Because the more educated we are, even with elementary school education, the lower the mortality rate of our children, the better able we are to support them. The more likely it is that we can actually choose how many children to have instead of having 10 children and having half of them die before they reach the age of 5 from some waterborne disease. There are really amazing positive solutions that transform people's lives for the better. And that's really, I think, what these solutions are all about.
I think that's absolutely excellent. So Alex, you?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to riff on what Katharine was just saying. We are not going to achieve big policy solutions by jamming it down non-believers' throats. Unfortunately, we have to, or unfortunately, we have to work towards solutions in a collaborative way and bring them along. And so making it tangible, working towards solutions that lead to agreement is a critical part of the process. Now we can't, go off and acknowledge merits in being a climate denier by any means, but we have to work with them and take the steps necessary to have them to get to shared views on solutions. Now, what gives me hope and optimism about this is in a campaign that we are still engaging in with the major national environmental groups to extend clean energy tax incentives for renewable energy and electric vehicles. We worked with a major polling firm to conduct a national survey, and it showed that 83% of Republicans favored the policy of tax incentives for renewable energy. Now that was off the charts positive, but what was even more surprising and more positive, it showed that a candidate who supports extending clean energy incentives would see a 21-point boost compared to a candidate who opposed incentives. Now, what that signals to us in the policy and political world is that not only is it good policy to incentivize renewable energy, but that we can work on the political level to encourage politicians to get on board with this policy by showing that it's good for their reelection.
Yep. Okay, so we have a massive list from how can we change cities to the role of nuclear, to what is the social cost of carbon, to how much of a rebound effect will we see after COVID, to some of the specifics on, there's an interesting debate going on about a certain California Senate bill right now. So I'm gonna try to bounce through these and literally let the panelists kind of jump in on a variety of them. So I'm going to start with one here that just popped up in terms of the difference in the cost of utility scale solar and residential solar, because it's an interesting one in the sense that when solar was very expensive, that difference was large. But as we've now seen the price of the solar panels come down dramatically, that price has narrowed. And in fact, we've almost flipped from a world where 15 years ago, 2/3 or more of the cost of a solar system was the panel, to the reverse, where it's all the little other bits. And I definitely know that that Adam and Alex have comments, and Katharine might as well. But anyone want to jump in on where we are in terms of solar's prices today? Alex, let me start with you.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, so that is a claim that's made regularly, and really we are comparing apples to oranges by trying to do that. So residential solar and small scale solar on a business is it avoids the need for transmission for that solar to be utilized by the customer. So the majority of the electricity is generated and consumed on site, and what's not consumed on site is consumed nearby that source of generation. Now, as we add batteries onto these systems, and that is rapidly becoming ubiquitous in California, you consume even more of the solar energy that you generate at home on site. So that makes your solar plus battery system look a lot more like energy efficiency, because you are reducing the consumption of electricity from the grid, consuming on-site energy that you have produced, you have paid for, and reducing the burden on the rest of society. Now, there's an additional layer of value that you get from that on-site residential energy with a battery is these aggregations that I was talking about, these virtual power plants. When you combine a cluster of, say, 1,000 residential solar and battery systems, all those customers get those benefits I was just talking about. But we are also able to provide, say, a community choice aggregator like the East Bay Community Energy with grid resources that are needed for their operations as well. So it's very difficult to compare one for one the two energy sources, because they provide some quite different values.
Attributed to Al Gore is very much that it's a world of, we need not just a single silver bullet, but silver buckshot, where the opportunity to do rooftop solar, large solar, some of it tied to storage. It's a very interesting and diverse mix. But I think I might have cut off someone. Was that Katharine going to say something?
Yep, that was me. I was just about to say, I'm not an expert on the economic investments required for these two different types of infrastructure, but I do think it's actually important to acknowledge that they're very much a transition of the entire energy infrastructure. And I do think that a parallel way to think about it is not solar panels becoming necessarily cheaper for your typical homeowner compared to utility scale investments. I think that where we're thinking now is, how do we make clean mobility and electric vehicles, and to think forward and to think future, as you've commented about how Mercedes is, transitioning entirely out of gasoline. And so I guess I just think that that's where we really need to be thinking, is how can we serve all communities in these transitions? And so it's not just the people who can afford a Tesla being the first to benefit from them, but really trying to spread the benefit as far and wide as we can. And so of course we know that there's a lot of economic reasons that these technologies are adopted in the ways that they are, but I think we can really think about how to chip away at that and also build out a clean infrastructure that serves everybody and not just people.
Yeah, and this really gets to one of the questions that's come up again and again, and that is, are we going to simply see what we call on the economic side a rebound effect? As the COVID crisis wanes, will people's consumption levels not just go back to where they are, but will they make up for missed consumption? And if we subsidize dirty energy as part of that, are we essentially doubling down on dirty as opposed to investing in clean? And I know that all of the panelists have comments here, and maybe one out of 5 or 6 questions have come up are related to that. So let me kind of bounce around. And Katharine, what's your feeling on what we can do, or what are our challenges on this rebound issue?
Well, The problem is that, again, the fact that we've reduced carbon emissions and air pollution by non-sustainable methods means it will bounce pretty much right back up. Now, we certainly have some potential for people to understand that, you know what, I don't need to get on that airplane as much as I used to. I don't need to drive as much as I used to. I don't need to go out to eat as much as I used to. There is the potential for individual changes, and even potentially in an organization or corporation or even a university that discovered, hey, we can do a lot of stuff online and save money. There is that potential, and those changes could be sustainable, but they are only a fraction of what accounts for the reduction that we're experiencing right now. And so what we're likely to see is the carbon emissions bounce right back up again. Now, granted, there will be some that were saved. There will be a net savings from these 1 or 2 or 3 months. But when they bounce back up again, who knows, they might even go a little bit higher to try to make up for lost production. So again, the good news here, as I said, is not that we cut carbon emissions now because it's not permanent. The potentially good news is that we got anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of the way to our Paris target in 2 months. So if we can do that again through such draconian measures, what could we do with much more positive, beneficial, constructive measures? I really think we might be able to do it.
Okay, let me jump to another one here, and that is this issue about batteries. And so we've heard that lithium-ion works fairly well. There are some technical limitations, but one of the interesting features is that for a long time, material science experts thought that batteries were about as good as they were going to get, because almost everyone's experience with batteries was the lead-acid batteries from our cars, which are actually designed not to give you long-term power for your devices, but to give you a lot of current all at once. And so we need to innovate. Lithium ion came first. Now we have a type of liquid battery called a flow battery that doesn't degrade every few hundred to few thousand cycles, but 1,000,000 cycles. And if you really take the energy storage to the long term, a number of companies have sprung up. There's one in Switzerland, there's one in Southern California, one in Australia, that all noted that one way to store things for a long time is to pump it uphill. We're used to pumping water uphill. In fact, California has a very large resource of so-called pumped hydro. But if you think about it, hydro is actually a rare resource here. So why not pump something else? So now we have companies that have formed. One's called Energy Vault. One is called Swiss Vault. And they pump rock or concrete uphill. After all, it doesn't have to be water, just has to have mass. So they're doing long-term storage by moving physical objects up a hill or up a tower and then bringing it back down when you need to. And so I want to ask Alex to jump in, because some of the work that's been going on at Sunrun has been to both find out which types of customers that used to be good just for solar are also good for distributed storage. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about what's taking place on the business side here.
Yeah, I mean, I think I approach that issue in a couple different ways. From the Sunrun view, we are a company that provides access and solutions, and we're not necessarily wedded to a particular technology. Now, of course, we're doing we're doing solar, and solar panels, collect sunlight, and we're doing storage. And right now, the best battery technology we have are lithium-ion batteries. But as technology evolves and improves, our goal is to provide customers with clean energy resources, and improve that, be more, capture as much of that as possible, and make it as low cost for those customers as possible, and also innovate on the business side, ways to make it cheaper for them so that they don't have to come out of pocket, $20,000, $30,000 in order to have access to that. So we can provide access to broader income classes. So that inherently means that, you are using the more tested mainstream technologies that you can purchase from major manufacturer, and we package them and provide the solutions. Now, looking at the technologies themselves, it's fundamental, incredibly important that our country be investing in innovation and supporting our national labs treasures, which really, you know, lead in innovating on material science, helping out small companies that are doing research and exploring these innovations like improved flow batteries and even earlier stage battery technologies. You know, new materials that collect sunlight that put current solar panels to shame, but are a little bit but are still too expensive to deploy commercially. So this plays a fundamental and important role. And actually, you know, now that we are in a position of looking at future stimulus dollars coming out of Congress, you know, in 2008, when we were climbing out of the recession at that point, Congress passed an enormous spending package that included an injection of dollars into clean energy research and technology development, and we are still to this day reaping the benefits of those investments. You know, we would have done more if there was more and better investment, and there are a lot of people making strong policy cases that we should be doing that again.
Great list here coming up. Let me ask about local resilience. And I know we're going to lose Katharine in a bit. I just want to thank you once again for coming on with us. Really, really appreciate. Let me jump to this question of local resilience in the process here. A couple comments I've highlighted. If we look at just the cost per kilowatt hour, we're not highlighting the services that those first few kilowatt hours, whether it's on a tribal reservation, whether it's in a low-income community. What are some of the things that we can do to not make this just about dollars and cents for the biggest customers? What are some of the opportunities to really think about what these investments mean for people who are living paycheck to paycheck, and where the investment is very hard to think about an electric vehicle or a solar panel?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we look for solutions and actionable ways that we can fight climate change, I think that there's a lot of ways we can do that. And I also think that our model at Grid, and I think that a lot of change models do suggest that local solutions tend to be the most effective. The local community knows the local needs, the resource constraints, and how to navigate an unknown and uncertain future. A couple examples come to mind that I think kind of represent this. One is that as I mentioned with some of the Native American tribes that we work with, for some of those tribes, there is very much a climate change like knocking at their door. They have forest fires that are threatening their very existence in their tribal landscapes. They have rivers that are drying up that sustain them, and they rely on the fish for food. And there's just all kinds of different environmental challenges that these tribes face. And so energy, which I know we've been talking a lot about energy in this conversation, is one component of that. Energy efficiency is also another component. But there's a lot of different ways that we can work with local solutions to try and find ways to help their variety of different situations. And as we also know, particularly in states like California, there's been targeted resources towards disadvantaged communities. So those communities that are also facing first of the pollution and the polluters. At the same time, there is an overlapping map of low-income communities in our state that are very much the same map, or very, very similar versions of the same. And so it is really important that we do think about what a local community's need is going to be, particularly as we think about how we can find resources that will help them with resilience. I know across the state of California, massive swaths of our state are now facing regular public safety power shutoffs, and they have new solutions that they need on energy that require them to adopt battery technologies as well. So I think that every local context, and this is something that I'm learning more and more about as we become kind of more national in our scope at Grid, is every community is very much different, and getting to know the local community's needs is very much, I think, part to finding the solution that serves the community, but also the more communities that are served, the more collectively the benefit will be felt.
In fact, one of the features that I'm actually most proud of for California is not setting this target of being zero carbon or carbon negative by 2045. That's a big challenge. Thankfully, California is now joined by New York State, Washington, New Mexico. Others are coming along and meeting that target. But California was the first state to build environmental justice, where this 35% or more of the cap and trade revenues, which are currently $10 billion a year, need to be spent in these areas. So it's fairly easy to identify projects that would go into affluent communities in northern Southern California on the coastline. What are some of the things that we need to do what Alex mentioned, to get community-based systems in place, or in particular to work with tribes or other groups that might not have the resources to really define the projects and to build out? What are some of the partnership opportunities for the people on the call here, the webinar, to get involved and to be part of that social change, not just the technical change?
I mean, I'm going to give a shout out for Grid Alternatives. I mean, volunteer for Grid Alternatives. I mean, this is where government comes in, and this is where we need people at the grassroots and the expert level to be weighing in with government, because, you know, when it comes to serving underserved communities, you know, there are many cases where businesses can't inherently do it economically, but we still should be. And that's where government programs to help incentivize it and make technologies, clean energy technologies, energy efficiency, you know, you name it, available to communities so that they can be part of this transition. It's essential, and that's where organizations like Grid Alternatives come in and are so important, because they are kind of the enabler of those incentive programs to serve those underserved communities. They identify, you know, folks in need, and then they help connect the dots between, you know, the government resources, the communities in needs, and companies like Sunrun, so that we can make it available and do those installations. But this needs to happen at a much broader scale. You know, California has a pretty good example of one program, a couple good examples of programs doing this. They have a program that incentivizes solar on multifamily homes. It's called SOMA, I'm forgetting what the acronym actually stands for, but it does provide a very generous incentive for us to do solar installations on multifamily housing, which, you know, has been a terribly difficult market for solar companies to economically provide. But now that we're doing it, bringing down the costs, eventually those incentive and subsidy programs will be able to go away. Another example is batteries. California has a marquee battery program called the Self-Generation Incentive Program, which provides, you know, varying levels of incentives for battery systems. The highest being for low-income for a low-income home that installs a battery in a wildfire vulnerable area. And that's exactly where we really do need to target some resources. And so programs that recognize that, try to fill the void that businesses are making and move them to providing service to vulnerable and underserved communities are critical.
In fact, there's a shout out for California Senate Bill 1314, which really is an investment in local communities. It's a way to bring resources, to invest in efficiency, to actually make sure that our poorest communities don't become electric vehicle charging station deserts, as we know some of them have become deserts in terms of food availability. So there are bills on the table in California, and people on the webinar who want to jump in. One of the best ways is to let your members of the California Assembly and Senate know that you support them. Thankfully, California makes searching the bills on the state website a very easy way to go. I'm going to go back to a question that originally came up for Adam in the chat earlier on, and it was about engaging K through 12 students. And I asked this for a couple reasons. One is that I was at the climate conference in Madrid this past December, and that conference started quite well. There was a very popular dialogue. There were thousands of people trailing behind Greta Thunberg. But as the week progressed, it became clear that the powers that be, the fossil fuel states, really did not want to have a dialogue with young people. And in terms of turning that conversation around, can you describe a little bit about the youth engagement programs that you've been involved with, Adam? And I'll afterwards, Alec wants to jump in, and I'll also highlight one that I've seen where really the idea of Fridays for the Future, the youth movement on climate, the Extinction Rebellion are really all efforts to harness the frustration and the talent of young people to be part of this conversation. What can we really do to expand that youth climate dialogue? And certainly one of the notes that came up, the Sunrise movement is a really interesting example of reaching out in unconventional ways.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one quick plug before I comment on the youth thing, because it came to mind when Alex was talking. Of course, obviously, we need urgent action on the policy front, starting with the top. I mean, federal leadership is totally lacking in this area, and so we need to do something about that. But I just wanted to share a resource with everybody. If you go to lowincomesolar.org, we produced in partnership with an organization called Vote Solar, which is the leading solar advocacy political organization. Lowincomesolar.org has resources that communities can adapt to try and advocate and to create climate action plans and other things that will help low-income communities in any region and in any place. It's kind of meant to be a resource guide for those people that are working in that space. So I'll put that in the chat too, but just wanted to make the plug for that, because we certainly do need policy changes in order to really do something in a major way about climate change. On the youth engagement, I mean, I think that this is a super important area. It's one we struggle with a little bit at Grid, in part because we're very much a construction company. I would guess that Sunrun would have similar challenges. We can't actually let minors on the roof of our installations. When we do ground mounts, we can engage with them, but under strict safety protocols. So most of our programming around youth is really helping them to better understand how technology can provide solutions to some of our most pressing problems, including energy issues and climate change, and to really make that clear, that connection clear to them, and also to really engage with them about how they can engage in ways that will hopefully spark career pathways in STEM fields. Right? There's very much a hands-on maker attitude to a lot of the work that we do. And so our messaging can very much be around that. When you get a little bit older, and once you're not a minor, you can get on the roof with our programs. And so as I chatted as well, we have a solar spring break program that engages with college students from all over the country, including Cal. They basically learn about the technology through the service learning and service opportunities. And so we very much as a nonprofit organization see that one way to engage youth is through service and through service learning. And so that's sort of a core pillar of their engagement there, but also to really think about futures and career pathways. So job training as a solar installer, if that's your interest, but really in any STEM field related to energy is something that we want to promote, and inspire inquiry and connection to the technology. So that's, I think, kind of the way that we approach that. I think there's probably a lot of opportunity for us to be doing more, particularly in youth engagement through things like climate strikes, as you mentioned. They're happening all of the time. With ways that we can, have messaging through social media. We're trying to be cooler and cooler at Grid. I don't know how successful we are at doing that because I'm not a youth, but I do think that we can get creative about different types of engagement and different types of audiences.
Yeah. And what about on the reservation? I've talked to groups like Native Son. There's been a number of groups where youth wanting to really reclaim some agency have seen off-grid energy, have seen mini grids, for example, as something which work technically, but have not been supported at the tribal level or the federal level. There's some opportunities on Native American communities.
Yeah, actually, two interesting areas where we see that in Native communities in particular are a lot of the solar installations we do with tribes is actually the community centers. So kids are playing basketball right next to our teams installing, and they're naturally curious. And so that kind of exposure is really super helpful. We actually, interestingly as well, try to reach elders in these communities because they're often the hardest to reach. And often tribal communities have an elder center or a senior center where we're trying to save them money on their energy. And so we engage with the oldest side of spectrum as well. We do see that this sort of community-based model is one that engages people. Another way that we kind of see that you wouldn't maybe just think of, but it's beyond tribal communities, is just the families that we serve. When we install solar on a single family home, that family for the time during the installation is rather captivated with what we're doing on their roof. But we also see that the neighbors and the kids that play around next door are looking at us up there and they're wondering what the heck is going on. And so that engaging with communities is really engaging with every person that that can be kind of a part about what you're doing. And I really think that I kind of commented this, and I don't know if I did it privately or publicly, but solar almost has this sort of contagious effect where if people see, oh, my neighbor has that, can I get that too? And for low-income communities, that message is often that they don't think that they can. And so when you can see that visible engagement, I think you can really start to see more of a movement. And I think communities come, in all different ages and backgrounds. And so I think that's like kind of part of what we want to engage with when we do the work.
Yeah. In fact, I'll do a shout out because I see someone on the call, David Woolley, who's a colleague of mine here at the Goldman School, who runs our Environmental Policy Center. And he's been working both with the Port of Oakland to find ways to reduce emissions by having electric plug-ins so trucks don't need to idle. And the biggest ally of that is the low-income communities that often ring things like the ports, who get that daily pollution, and getting them on their side in terms of community meetings, in terms of educating workers that you don't need to run diesel trucks all night. We'll build plug-in for electricity. Some of those community industry partnerships are some of the best ways to both invest in mini grids, to find new partnerships, as Katharine Hayhoe was saying. And those are some of those surprises, those opportunities where we need to change laws, we need to enable mini grids, but we also need new coalitions to form to really help that out. So Alex, I'd love for you to jump in on any of these that kind of strike your fancy as well.
Yeah, I mean, actually just keeping on the subject you were talking about, sometimes from the industry view, you need to walk into a community, offer some assistance and ask how you can be helpful and start to listen. And, one example of where we did that was after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. A philanthropist called us and said, hey, we're here, we're trying to figure out solutions for fire stations. We don't know what we can do, but we can provide some logistical support if you can, donate some solar systems and batteries to these fire stations. So, we took that to our CEO, and she said, yeah, let's make it happen. And we were able to do installations for fire stations. That provided like an incredible temporary, filled an incredible temporary need. But what it evolved to was people saw, oh, wow, these fire stations, their lights are on, and our entire grid was devastated by this hurricane. More families need to have access to this resource. So quickly, that led to legislation being passed. The government adopting very high renewable energy adoption requirements. And we have opened up a market providing solar and battery storage to folks in the island, as have several other solar companies. So it's been really one of those success stories that the structure wasn't there for us. We had to walk into the community, figure out what was needed, listen, take the feedback, and then put it together. Put it together based on the need.
Yeah. In fact, I'll do two more because I know that in our new world of Zoom etiquette, ending 10 minutes before is great. So we'll wrap this up at 10 of 7, but I'll just highlight two final things and then just ask the panelists for their last comment. One certainly is that cities are, of course, hit hardest by COVID right now, and they're also where we're learning that things like Zoom calls and opportunities to become more efficient is part of the solution. Globally, what we're seeing also is an effort to make buildings not just the place where we live, but also net sources of power. and by installing anything from heat pumps to batteries in the basements to utilizing buildings as large structures where we can now install solar panels that are themselves transparent, so windows can be generating power. There's a real way to think differently about our cities, and we will post some of these on the Solve Climate by 2030 website. The last thing I'll mention again before giving our two panelists the remaining kind of a closing comment in this regard is that we have seen a number of efforts that have changed how we manufacture. California, for example, is a state that has something called the right to repair. It's basically an ability to open up the supply chain so that if you have electronics that you want to repair, you can't be blocked from doing so. And actually this cuts down our waste. It allows us to think much more about our agency. We don't just order things from Amazon. We find ways to rebuild things. And these are some of the lessons that I'm personally hoping will come out of the process. Can we, for example, build new solar panels that are easier to recycle? Can we do trip chaining, where instead of going to 5 different stores, 5 different trips, we incentivize ourselves to combine them, as many of us are doing right now in COVID. And all of these things are items that we will post on the Solve Climate by 2030 website, and we will provide links, as you saw in the chat box here. And so as we wrap up, I want to thank Alex and Adam tremendously, but again, a final comment that you have for people on this call who are really here to think about what might they do, where might they engage going forward in this process. Let me start with Alex.
Yeah, one of the biggest takeaways I think we can all have from the COVID-19 public health crisis is that we are all in it together, as Professor Kammen said, and we're all part of the solution. And so I think that if we approach climate change in the same way, and you know, maybe it sounds cheesy, but if we take the steps necessary in our own lives and do follow some of the practices that Professor Kammen, you know, is going to circulate, I think that we will have a big impact on where our policy environment is going. The political leaders are watching what people are doing right now. They are seeing that people are pitching in and necessarily part of this solution. They are putting, you know, strict government orders to mandate it, but also watching the generous actions that society is taking towards one another in order to keep each other healthy and safe. We need to keep the spirit alive and address climate change in much the same way.
Yeah. Adam?
Well, let me say thank you again for the honor of being on this panel today. You know, I think what really stands out to me from this conversation is really the power of partnerships and how we all need collective action from a variety of stakeholders and all sectors of society. So I just really think that we have academia, we have the private sector and corporate, you know, involvement in this work. We have political advocates and political change makers, and we also have people who are voting, people who are donating, people who are rallying, people who are showing up at these climate marches. And I just really want to say that it takes organizations like GRID, it takes companies like SunPower, it takes universities like Berkeley, it takes all of us to really take this challenge of the climate crisis on. And I just want to end on a note of optimism, because the work that I do on a daily basis is really much partnership based, and it's some of the most heartwarming work you'll see out there. So plug for anyone who's interested in a nonprofit career. But I do enjoy the conversation and to be able to be a part of the dialogue around what we're going to do around this very important climate crisis ahead of us.
Yeah, and I want to just wrap up by thanking our panelists for being on. I want to thank Eben Goodstein and Dave Blockstein at the national level for organizing it. And I want to thank our local team here, Darian and Bora and Hannah and Sergey, for making all this possible. Again, we will post not only the slides, but we'll also post the video. And we're looking forward for you to, as you kind of see the next stages in the climate battle and learn some lessons from COVID, that we're hoping this whole process really becomes a resource for all of you. Everyone out there, be safe. Thank you. And again, thanks to our panelists and for everyone for participating. We will hopefully see you all soon on the battle for a climate improved world by 2030. Thank you so much for being on. Good night.